Hello, my name is Autumn Drew. I decided to do the carbon cycle for my video assignment. This is from chapter 46. The first thing you need to know when you want to learn the carbon cycle is what the carbon cycle actually is. The carbon cycle is the cycle of carbon and how it moves around Earth's atmosphere, oceans, rocks, soils, and how it moves throughout the food webs. The first thing to happen in the carbon cycle is photosynthesis. This happens whenever plants take in oxygen and water and sunlight to then release carbon dioxide. This then goes to the animals that eat those plants and to the atmosphere, and this begins the carbon cycle. The second thing to happen in the carbon cycle is aerobic respiration. This is through animals breathing and plants using photosynthesis. Whenever animals take in oxygen, they release carbon dioxide, which then goes into the atmosphere. The next thing that happens in the carbon cycle is diffusion between atmosphere and ocean, and this happens through evaporation and precipitation. The water on the ocean that has carbon in it will evaporate and go into the atmosphere, and then it will precipitate and rain back down to the ocean and the land and continue the carbon cycle. The next thing is the ocean. The ocean has many organisms in it, like plants, microorganisms, and fish. All of these organisms take in oxygen through the ocean and release carbon dioxide through respiration. And then as before when we discussed diffusion, it will go into the atmosphere and then come back down through evaporation and precipitation. The next thing is sedimentation. This is whenever you have crustacean or shelled animals and their shells become carbon rich, and then whenever they die, their shells will become part of the rocks and sediments of the Earth's crust and will become carbon rich, such as limestone and chalk, and they will stay in the Earth's crust. The last thing that happens in the carbon cycle is the burning of fossil fuels. This is the more human side of the carbon cycle. Humans tend to burn a lot of fossil fuels, like whenever we drive cars, our exhaust, plants, whenever they have big smokestacks. This just puts that carbon back into the atmosphere and continues the carbon cycle. In general, the carbon cycle is an atmospheric cycle, and this means that it has a gaseous form of an element that plays a very significant role. The Earth's atmosphere, or the atmosphere in general, holds about 760 gigatons of carbon, and the main form of this carbon is in carbon dioxide. And all that carbon dioxide, which is released through photosynthesis, aerobic respiration, diffusion, and the burning of fossil fuels, that all returns that carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, and that's why there's so much carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. The next type of carbon cycle is the terrestrial carbon cycle. This is the carbon cycle that takes on land through plants. This mainly occurs whenever plants take up carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, incorporate it into their tissues when they carry out photosynthesis. And it also happens with other land animals or organisms whenever they release carbon dioxide through aerobic respiration. The soil of the Earth contains at least 1,600 gigatons of carbon, more than twice as much as the atmosphere. The soil carbon consists of human and living soil organisms. Over time, bacteria and the fungus in the soil decompose and release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and so most carbon is stored in living organisms rather than in the soil. There's a lot of conservation of the forest and grassland to reduce the amount of carbon in the atmosphere and in the ground. Tilling soil increases the rate at which carbon enters the air because it destroys something called the hyphae and the glomeruli fungi, which is a type of fungus that normally holds onto organic matter and slows down decomposition. The next type of carbon cycle is the marine carbon cycle. The seawater in the ocean holds about 40,000 gigatons of carbon, about 50 times as much as is in the atmosphere. This main form of carbon in the seawater is CO2, and the marine producers convert bicarbonate into CO2 for their use in photosynthesis, and many marine organisms release CO2 by aerobic respiration as they did in terrestrial carbon cycle. Some marine organisms, such as foraminifera and shelled animals like mollusks and hermit crabs, and all their reef-building corals, also store carbon in their hardened parts like their shells and their claws and such. The marine sediments, like the rocks down at the bottom of the ocean, also store a large portion of the carbon, with more than 65 gigatons. The amount of limestone that is at the bottom of the ocean and the other sedimentary rocks form whenever the calcium carbonate shells of those animals that live in the ocean die and they form together, and that holds a large portion of carbon. Carbon in rocks is not available to the producers though, so this vast store of oxygen has very little effect on ecosystems. The geological part of this cycle is completed as erosion. Whenever it rains, the rocks run down and slowly erode away, releasing that carbon into the seas and into the oceans. The last thing I want to talk about is carbon in fossil fuels. These such fossil fuels as coal and oil and natural gas hold an estimated 5,000 gigatons of carbon. There's a lot of deposits of fossil fuels that have happened over hundreds of millions of years from the carbon-rich remains of the carbon-rich shells, like those mollusks and everything. The high pressure and temperature transformed the remains of those ancient land plants into coal. A similar process transformed the remains of plankton to deposits of oil and natural gas. It wasn't until very recently that the carbon in fossil fuels, like the carbon in rocks, had the impact on ecosystems. Currently, our burning of this fossil fuel aids billions of tons of CO2 to the atmosphere every year. So whenever we drive around, we release that carbon dioxide, and whenever we have big plants that have huge smokestacks, nuclear plants, carpet plants, car plants, any kind of plant that has a smokestack, those release fossil fuels into the atmosphere, and the atmosphere continues to grow in carbon dioxide. And that carbon dioxide isn't always a good thing, but it just builds up so much, and it will eventually be brung back down through precipitation back onto the earth.